We have an update on a story that we first told you about yesterday. The 16-year-old boy from Guatemala who died in U.S. custody had been diagnosed with the flu right before his death. U.S. Customs and Border Protection confirmed Carlos Gregorio Hernandez Vásquez was found unresponsive Monday in a Texas facility. He was prescribed Tamiflu just a day before after he said he didn't feel well, and the teen had about 70 others were apprehended after crossing the southern border last week. He's the fifth Guatemalan child to die in U.S. custody since December. CBS News investigative reporter Graham Cates has been looking into this story. Graham, you and I were talking about this, that we have seen these cases increase. We hadn't seen this uptick in years. All of a sudden, we're seeing this. What makes this particular case different?
This one really is unique compared to the four that have happened since December. For starters, he was held by the Border Patrol for almost double the amount of time that he's allowed to be held. A child has to be transferred to the Office of Refugee Resettlement within 72 hours. And the reason is that's the agency that's really fit to care for children, especially compared to the Border Patrol, where kids are kept in the same facilities as adults. In this case, it was the McAllen Processing Center, which is kind of it's the famous one with the chain link barriers and people sleeping on pads. And ORR provides conditions more suitable. Yes, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, conditions more suitable to children.
So do we know, I mean, the notes here say the child was in custody since May 13th. Why was he held for that amount of time by the Border Patrol?
We're still trying to get to the bottom of that. HHS has said there's like one exception that applies to that rule, and that is if someone is sick. But Border Patrol has said basically that they didn't realize he was sick until Sunday, the day before he died. And so we're trying to nail down what was going on during those extra days. Did they know in advance? And if so, why wasn't he hospitalized? And why wasn't he given Tamiflu till that day before? I also want to note one other big difference, which is that the FBI is involved with the investigation into this death.
And that's unusual.
Yeah, they haven't been involved in any of the previous ones, and they're not leading this one, but they're following it, which is different than any of the other cases.
Do we know why the FBI is involved?
We haven't actually gotten that information either, but it tells you that this is something that they're at least taking more seriously in terms of investigating than the previous cases.
It's still so troubling that there have been 5 deaths, as you mentioned, since December. And before that, how many were there?
It had been years since the last unaccompanied child died in custody in the U.S. We don't have exact figures because we started tracking unaccompanied children in the late 80s, and the government hasn't really been providing figures up until now. But we know since December there have been 5, and before that it had been a very long time.
And do we know why we see these deaths in the past few months?
It's hard to say. Initially, I think the government said, look at the conditions of the children, specifically coming from Guatemala, where there's been a real spike in unaccompanied children since last year. But at this point, I mean, they're not the only kids coming to this country, and there's something happening with that population that is just different than with all the other ones.
Graham Cates, fascinating report. Thank you very much for joining us.